Okay, today is May 20 of 2014. We're going to take a look at Emmanuel Levinas, his book Difficult Freedom, which is his treatise. It's a 100-page essay on his position on the Judaic faith, situated within the context of postmodern thought. He dedicated the first 60 pages to the structure of the postmodern thought within Judaic faith, and then he had 40 pages of commentary. So altogether, it was a very brief monograph of 100 pages. But as usual for Levinas, it was packed with content, very, very detailed presentation. But he accomplished the entire project in 100 pages, and he centers it on the idea of freedom. But it's for the Judaic faith, that means ethical freedom. The fundamental underlying concept is the Judaic ethics, and the Judaic ethics takes priority over ontology in every instance. So his emphasis isn't to try to articulate a postmodern ontology or a postmodern metaphysic. It's an attempt to articulate a postmodern ethic, which is situated within the possibility of the Judaic faith. So it's ethics-oriented and not ontology-oriented. But it does address, within that ethic, it does address messianic hope, not messianic realization, but messianic hope, an eschatological messianic hope, which is a driving force of the Judaic ethic. So his approach is very much directed in that direction. It will, of course, be situated within the ontology that he presented in his Totality and Infinity, where he presented the triad of the Logos as interiority, exteriority, and coincidence. If you remember there, he said that the interiority of the psyche was coupled with the exteriority of the Dekunta threshold and our dialogue with other existentially interested selves and the deeper meaning of a situation. By combining the psyche individualism with the Dekunta threshold, conversation threshold of exteriority, and its emerging concepts, that you could form a coincidence between the two to form the notion of the true as a revealed content and revealed essence combined into one, which he called face. So he does situate this Judaic ethic within his ontology of totality and infinity, of interiority, exteriority, and coincidence. So he will address the interiority of the psyche, the exteriority of what he calls here this time spiritualizing, and then coincidence, which in this instance he will entitle investiture. So he's got the same triad, but it's going to be slightly different as he aligns it with the Judaic faith. So he doesn't abandon ontology, not by any means. He still retains ontology. He just wants to point out that for the Judaic faith, ontology is secondary and ethics is primary. So we're going to take a look at obviously the same structure, the same ontology, the same framework, but we will be looking at Judaic ethics. Now for Levinas, he says the Talmud is extremely important for him. The Talmud of the oral tradition of the Judaic faith is equally as important as the actual Torah of the biblical text. This is the old Pharisee position that the Talmud was important, as opposed to the Sadducee position, which had denied the importance of the Talmud. And that's why later we're going to see that within the ethical structure, Levinas proposes that we take up the concept and the modality of Pharisee as opposed to Sadducee. So he's going to actually have a positive appropriation of the concept Pharisee. But in the beginning, the Jewish interpretive philosophy is what we approach, and its traces of meaning which can be applied to our current situation. So the Talmud is a Jewish philosophical document that is an interpretive document that is interpretive toward the Torah and interpretive toward history, and therefore it's an ongoing dynamic that Levinas says we continue to reawaken and continue to participate in, and that's why his treatise here includes a 40-page section of commentary. He even titles it commentary. So philosophical commentary is still very essential to any Judaic ethic, and the Talmud is supposed to be approached in the beginning, and then we will operate full circle through the various moments of ethical freedom, and we will return again to the Talmud. Now, the journey of the psyche always begins in violence because it acts as if the psyche is alone instead of within a communal responsibility, and so it's given the masculine nature of an individualistic violence of the unconscious that wants to appropriate and possess the units of meaning that are present in a current situation. This is going to be countered eventually when we reach the Dekunta threshold, where reason and language will emerge and the communal necessity of conversation becomes apparent. But this current intervention into the situation is the masculine, individualistic violence of the unconscious psyche, appropriating the units of meaning. Now, the methodology that Levinas proposes for the psyche is the messianic methodology. It's threefold. There is, number one, the individual future, which is the interiority of the psyche, the social realm or the era of the self that awaits the messianic break to appear. It's the realm of the personal order. Hope for a united humanity is present. And it reads the prophecies of justice in the Talmud. And it constitutes that moment of the opening of a perspective within the psyche self. So it's more that first stage of the psyche forming a individual perspective of the content and form of meaning in a current situation to give it its deeper depth of meaning. Now, the second moment of the methodology is going to be the prophetic trace of the Messianic era. It's inherently present in history as its deeper meaning. It actually exists between the eras of the social and the political. The social, he aligns more with the psyche, and the political, he aligns more with the cognitive. Here we have a hope for the end of political violence and a united humanity combined. Dialogue at the threshold aligns with the poor and desires a limit of political power and offers the interpretive gift of supplying the concepts for the notion of the true that the self will need. So the first moment is more or less the psyche. The second moment of the methodology is going to be the conversation threshold. The third moment is going to be what he calls messianic break. It's the messianic break with the psyche when we detach from the psyche to move on to the cognitive cogito, and the cogito then moves on to the self of praxis. So we go from psyche to cogito to praxis in the third moment, and that is the messianic break. The messianic break is called the Messiah scholar. That is the intermediary for the transitioning from psyche to cogito to praxis. We posit the attainment of future world as a notion of the true. The coming Messiah is actually the epikina other, outside of reason, so it's a kind of an irrational element its epikina. And the notion will articulate the first originary meaning of every concept, the originary logos. But this only occurs after passing through the Zakunta threshold. So Levinas kind of outlines his methodology as a messianic methodology where psyche is social, cogito is political, the threshold mediates between the two, and a threshold represents the revelation of prophetic traces of meaning through dialogue and conversation. So it goes psyche, threshold, notion, or psyche, trace, and the cogito. And that's going to be applied from the very beginning. That's going to be our approach to that methodology. But in order to even get past the psyche, we need to correct the individualistic beginning of psyche in the masculine. And for Levinas, that means we need to complete psyche with the feminine. There needs to be the conjugal bond of masculine and feminine to form the authentic consciousness of the psyche. The authentic consciousness of the psyche is the conjugal bond of masculine and feminine. It is the true restoration of the soul in its awakening through that conjugal bond. It's a faith moment of the self, positing the power to be or a reawakening of the psyche. The feminine figuration takes place. The feminine defines the dimension of interiority, and this includes 4 attributes of the psyche. The feminine supplies the illumination or the giving light to the epikina otherness with infinitude. The feminine supplies the equilibrium in realizing that we are taken up in the movement of identification of the infinite that always restores its infinity as it goes out into finitude and then returns to itself. The feminine is responsible for the restoration of overcoming the masculine idea of a conquering logos with the feminine idea of a sojourning logos that is sojourning through finitude in order to lift it through any gyro lifting to its true depth of spiritual meaning. And that restoration and illumination comes through the feminine. The feminine also supplies the criticism of the dominating masculine reason, the possessive reason, and it also criticizes the false duality that exists and posits instead a reciprocity of the epikina actually emptying itself into finitude and then lifting finitude to spirit. All of this is a figuration supplied by the feminine, and so the two are combined together in a conjugal bond to form a precognitive intelligibility as a thought picture of the movement of infinity that we can perceive in our current situation. And this is called the interiority, figuratively called, or metaphorically called, the interiority of the house. And it is the restoration of the psyche soul to its true awakening. So now we can say that we actually have completed a conjugal psyche figuration as a thought picture of the movement of identity of the epikina otherness in a situation that we face in order to picture in our minds the deeper sense of meaning, the deeper sense of spirit which wants to emerge in the situation. All of this is conjugal bond, and that takes us to the next moment of exteriority, which is going to be the composition threshold, or I should say conversation threshold. And in this book, in this 100-page treatise, Levinas gives us 10 aspects of the threshold, which he calls spiritualizing, the moment of spiritualizing. We judge our psyche experience in light of the link of discourse and dialogue. The order of conversation replaces the violence of possession. The greeting of the other takes place at the threshold in a speaking and knowing of the epikina other, an unveiling of this otherness. We form a communal appeal to the epikina other, and the self of possession is of course negated, and we form two generic concepts here, the generic concept of justice and the generic concept of being. They're both discovered here in dialogue, and we take up an existential stance of aiming toward the epikina otherness that wants to emerge. And we discover the epikina other of Moses, where God declares I am, when Moses asks for the name of infinity, the name of God, and the answer is I am. The answer is being, so the epikina otherness equals the irreducible identity of being. The epikina otherness equals the I am of being as an irreducible identity. The principle of discourse is thou shalt not kill, and that means that the signs are unveiled and classified. Finite objects are opposed, but they're maintained because we don't have a duality anymore. We have an emergence through finitude, so we don't kill. We don't oppose and kill finitude. We oppose finitude, of course, but we maintain it in that we see the epikina otherness emerging up through it in an egeiro resurrection type lifting. So we cannot simply oppose and kill the finite aspect. Spiritual hearing tells us not to kill. This creates the moment of understanding at the threshold of conversation. We reach the moment of understanding. So we've now moved on from conjugal bond to understanding, from conjugal bond to understanding, and we have an understanding that is ready to transition to the cognitive element of the notion of the true. So we're ready for transition. Now we transition to the notion of the true. Levinas gives us 15 aspects. Now here we're going to articulate the universality of the self, the movement of the speaking to the epikina otherness, and it's going to be movement out of the self in ethics. There's going to be an ethical approach. It's going to be a positing of the vision of our face-to-face encounter with the otherness we experienced at the threshold. But now we are going to conceptually articulate that which we discovered at the conversation threshold of dialogue with others. So we begin with this ethical articulation of a project of a commerce with other beings situated within the generic concepts of justice and existential being. He calls this articulating not notion, but articulating the voice of Israel. So from the Judaic faith, we say that we are going to posit the notion of the voice of Israel. It evolves out of our education at the threshold. Like Moses, we are enveloped and transported out of ourselves. It's a moment of transitioning from infinite understanding to mystical virtue, from the infinite understanding at the threshold to mystical virtue as the notion of the true. So we're going to have an idea of incarnation here that is actually working through the finitude, but we're going to negate the idea of a sacralization of infinity. And this is important. Levinas says Moses never ascended to heaven. God never came down from Sinai. Instead, God enclosed and blanketed Sinai in a cover of heaven so that Moses remained finite and God remained in heaven, but mediation took place. Remember, Moses could not look on the face of God. We posit a negation of this false numinous concept of the sacred, and instead we want to integrate our finite freedom with our desire for transcendence. We perceive otherness as that which has invested itself in humanity, and otherness which has invested itself in finitude. So we negate all individualism, and we reach for the promised land, which means the idea of the infinite that has invested itself in the finite. Investiture of the other is articulated as a notion of the voice of Israel. An investiture of the infinite epikina otherness into finitude is what we posit in our positing of the notion, but it is the positing of the notion of voice, the voice of the figurative Israel. And Israel means the investiture of a covenant-type God investing in finitude with his epikina otherness. So it is investment, instead of an incarnation in a metaphysical sense, it's an investiture in a declarative sense. So it's more of a, you could almost look at it as a declarative speech act of investiture rather than a metaphysical incarnation. And so we want to posit this voice of Israel in a conceptual articulation of what we learned at the dialogue threshold. And so for Levinas, the axis of true subjectivity is given the metaphorical name of Israel. Our true subjectivity is named Israel. So our subjectivity has a name. Our subjective name is Israel. It is a universality, however. Israel signifies universality rather than a nationalism. It signifies our relation to being. We are the exiled self who relates to human society for any place or any promised landscape. People takes precedence over place, and this includes adopting the generic concepts of morality and ethics and justice through ethics. So we have this obligatory categorical imperative to work out an ethics of justice within humanity before seeking the utopia of the heavenly place, or the utopia of the beyond. Place is secondary, but ethical interaction with others is primary. That is what the sign name of Israel means for true subjectivity. Well, we have our notion of the voice of Israel. We have our understanding that we are an ethical Israel that works toward a intersubjective community of justice. So how do we form that as a praxis? How do we form that in a practical ethic that we can put into play in our real situation, our true situation, which is not an escapism from reality? According to Levinas, the Judaic faith is very much not an escapism. It truly addresses our true finite reality in a practical way of praxis. Now for Levinas, this means that we are involved in a covenant. The unveiled voice of the covenant must be translated into a praxis correlate. It is for the oppressed, directed toward the oppressed through our recollection of our own enslavement in the past to a possessive type attitude. In individualism, we seek to liberate the oppressed. Justice is the praxis correlate, and it will reflect our ethic of a reign of justice. We take up the metaphorical name of Pharisee. The Pharisee is the writer of the praxis of this ethic. He negates dogmatic axioms. He recalls the presentation of the declarative notion of investiture at Mount Sinai to Moses. He feels struck by the rod of Moses that opens up all static being, including our own static being. And he opposes false reason with reason and forms new questions after every positing and every fulfillment. So epistemology becomes directly linked with missiology. Missiology and epistemology are reciprocal. We learn by doing, and we do by learning. Epistemology and missiology inform each other, enforce each other, and empower each other. And so that gets us down to the actual act. And in this essay, Levinas really did talk about the actual act of writing. And in this way, he's kind of similar to our friend Derrida, because Derrida very much talks about an ethics of writing. Levinas does the same. He talks about writing the self's new identity. He lists it as a triad. You've got the already personal identity, a sense of having been chosen, a personal attentiveness to monotheism, a feeling of responsibility toward justice. Then there's the conversion of identity as two. It's where we have the acts of adhesion. We step back from the already and we accept a series of signs that we acquired at the threshold. It's a pretending of conversion, he says, because conversion really means accepting the series of concepts that we discovered at the dialogue threshold. And we take up a language of universality. And then the third moment is the written identity of universality, inscribing of the old documents, the Talmud. So he calls it a breathing. We breathe on the trace embers still glowing in the prophetic voice of the Talmud to reawaken it. And we write by enlisting and enhancing these trace epikina, evidences of deeper meaning and evidences of spirit. So it's an effect of literature. It's a return to the Talmud, but it can be a commentary of any type. In this case, he wrote 40 pages of commentary and a treatise on freedom. So you're not going to actually add to the Talmud, but you're going to introduce philosophical Judaic commentary in a book, in a document, in a speech, in any kind of a language act. But it's all literary writing for Levinas here and for Derrida. We've studied Derrida. Derrida very much is into the power of literary writing. So it's literary writing with an existential stance that addresses justice and being and universality. Those are the generic concepts: justice, being, and universality, in a literary positing that is a true writing in the true sense by the individual that takes up this philosophical stance of wanting to be attentive toward justice and universality. And it will involve very much continually returning to that threshold of dialogue, because we continue to acquire a series of concepts that we will use in this writing process. So it takes us full circle all the way back to the conclusion of Levinas's presentation, and that's going to be returning back to the psyche. And that means that you're going to, if you want to change the world, you're going to change the self. You're going to do some internal inscribing of your own on that wax tablet again. You'll lift the cellophane. You'll have a temporary erasure of that which existed before, but the deeper traces in the wax will remain, and you will have added to those trace imprints. The imprinting of the soul will be enhanced, the imprinting of the psyche, the imprinting of the psyche self, which is no longer the masculine, possessive, domination type psyche, but it's going to be the conjugal psyche that combines masculine and feminine in the conjugal bond to form a true figuration of self and a true figuration of justice for all humanity. That puts us at 30 minutes, and so that's going to wrap up Levinas on his difficult freedom, which is his postmodern thought from a perspective of the Judaic faith from 1963.